The human should have been dead before he hit the floor. Dr. Aris knew this the way he knew everything, completely, with the cold precision of 31 years in xenobiological medicine. He had seen what a Class-4 Velthari energy discharge did to a living body. He had written the paper on it. He had presented the paper at the Cooperative Medical Conference on Thessar Prime to an audience of 400 colleagues, and the conclusion had been unanimous and was now considered settled science. Class-4 Velthari energy discharge delivered at point-blank range to a humanoid torso was not survivable. The energy did not merely damage tissue. It disrupted the bioelectric field that every known carbon-based life form required to maintain cellular cohesion. The disruption cascaded. Every organ system that relied on bioelectric signaling, which was every organ system, failed in sequence. It took between 90 seconds and 4 minutes depending on species, and the dying was not quiet. The human had taken the discharge at approximately 1 meter. He had stepped in front of it. He had seen it coming, assessed the trajectory, calculated that the cadet behind him was in the direct line of fire, and stepped in front of a weapon that Aris had written a paper proving was unsurvivable, and he had done it in the time it took most beings to register that something was wrong. And now he was on Aris's examination table. Not dead. Aris stood over him and looked at his own instruments, and looked at the human, and looked at his instruments again. Not dead. Aris had been a doctor for 31 years. He had been wrong before. Not often, and not about things he had written papers on. But he was a scientist, and scientists acknowledged error when the data required it. The data currently required something he did not have a category for. He pulled up a chair, sat down next to the human cadet who should have been dead, and started working. Dr. Aris was not a sentimental being. He was 63 years old, chief of xenobiology at the Interspecies Medical Exchange Facility on Callan Station, and he had reached that age and that position by being the kind of doctor who trusted instruments over instinct, data over narrative, and peer-reviewed literature over the kind of breathless species mythology that passed for scientific discussion in the cooperative's general population. He was Grolian, a species with 4 eyes and a trilobed brain that gave them the capacity for parallel processing that made them exceptional diagnosticians. His species had been in medicine for 600 years. They had built half the cooperative's medical framework. They did not make errors of assessment. They did not miss things. He had missed something about humans. He was beginning to understand that he had missed something significant. The exchange facility was one of the cooperative's more ambitious projects, a rotating program that placed doctors from one species in medical facilities that treated other species, on the theory that medicine advanced faster when practitioners were forced to confront biology they had not been trained on. Aris had been placed here 8 months ago. He had treated Thar, Velthari, Quellian, Breath, and 14 other species in those 8 months. He had treated 2 humans. Both cases had been minor. Both had confirmed his existing assessment. Small, soft, unremarkable healing rates. Category 3 biological platform. The cadet on his table was about to revise that assessment in ways that Aris would spend the next 6 weeks trying to quantify and the rest of his career trying to explain. The cadet's name was Jordan Hayes, 22 years old. The incident report described him as a third-term cadet at the Galactic Military Institute who had been present at a weapons malfunction during a live-fire training exercise when a Class-4 Velthari energy weapon had discharged at point-blank range toward another cadet, a Breath female named Osei, and Hayes had physically interposed himself between the weapon and the other cadet in the approximately 0.4 seconds between discharge and impact. Aris had read the incident report 3 times. He kept reading the 0.4 seconds. Not because the physical act was impossible. Humans were faster than their size suggested. That was documented. 0.4 seconds for a human to recognize, decide, and move was at the outer edge of documented human reaction time, but within the range. What he kept reading 0.4 seconds for was the decision inside it. In 0.4 seconds, Jordan Hayes had looked at a weapon discharge, identified the trajectory, identified the likely recipient, calculated that the likely recipient was not himself, and stepped in front of it. Not reacted. Decided. Aris had a colleague, a Velthari neuroscientist named Dr. Fenn, who had been studying human decision-making architecture for 3 years. Fenn had told him once, over a meal in the facility's staff lounge, that the thing that distinguished human neurological processing was not speed. Several species were faster. It was not processing capacity. Several species had more. It was something Finn described as decision weight, the capacity to make a high-cost, irreversible choice in a compressed time window without the neurological hesitation cascade that most species exhibited when the cost of a choice exceeded a certain threshold. Most beings, when facing a choice that might kill them, experienced a hesitation cascade. It was biological. It was protective. It was the nervous system's way of demanding more data before committing to something irreversible. In 0.4 seconds, Hayes had experienced no measurable hesitation cascade. He had simply decided. Aris had dismissed Finn's research at the time as insufficiently rigorous. He was revising that dismissal now, at 0300 station time, alone in his medical bay with a human who should have been dead and was not. The first hour was the most medically alarming hour of Aris's career. Hayes came in with a bioelectric field disruption that the instruments measured at 87%. For context, a disruption of 60% was considered fatal in most species. A disruption of 70% was considered instantaneously fatal. Aris had his entire emergency team on the case within 3 minutes of arrival. They worked with the focused efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this kind of crisis. The problem was that nothing they were doing should have been keeping him alive, and he was alive anyway. The bioelectric disruption was severe and cascading, and the instruments said his cellular cohesion was failing in exactly the sequence Aris's paper had described, and the instruments were correct about the sequence, but wrong about the conclusion, because the conclusion was supposed to be death, and Hayes was not dead. His hearts, both of them, the redundant cardiac system that humans had, which Aris had always considered an interesting evolutionary footnote rather than a meaningful advantage, were continuing to function. Not well. Arrhythmic, weak, clearly under extreme stress. But functioning. At 47 minutes, Nurse Thiel, a Velthari who had been in medicine for 20 years and was not easily shaken, said very quietly to Aris, "His cellular cohesion is restabilizing." Aris looked at the relevant display. The cascade was slowing. Not because of anything they had done. They had been managing symptoms, buying time, doing what you did when a patient was dying, and you could not stop it, but you could slow it. They had not done anything that would address the root bioelectric disruption. The root bioelectric disruption was addressing itself. Aris said nothing. He watched the display for 4 minutes. The restabilization continued. Slow, but continuous, and the directionality was unmistakable. The disruption was being corrected from the inside, by a biological process that was not in any medical literature Aris had ever read, by a body that had been told by physics and chemistry and 31 years of settled science that it was dying and had apparently not received the message. He said to Thiel, "Run the full cellular analysis. Every marker. Start with the bioelectric recovery pathway and work outward." Thiel said, "What am I looking for?" Aris looked at Jordan Hayes, unconscious on the table, vital signs wrong in 17 different ways and improving in all of them. He said, "I do not know yet. That is the problem." By hour 6 the improvement was undeniable and inexplicable in equal measure. Hayes was not out of danger. Aris was not going to make that assessment until he had 72 hours of clean data. But the trajectory was wrong. Wrong in the specific way that meant better. The bioelectric field disruption had dropped from 87% to 61%, which was still catastrophic, but was 31% less catastrophic than it had been 6 hours ago, and it was moving in one direction and one direction only. The cellular analysis Thiel had run came back at hour 4, and Aris had been reading it since. Every species in the cooperative had a bioelectric recovery pathway. It was a basic biological feature, the mechanism by which cells repaired minor bioelectric disruption from everyday environmental exposure. In most species, it was a slow, low-capacity process adequate for minor disruption and completely inadequate for anything serious. It was the biological equivalent of a drain in a flooding room, useful for small spills, irrelevant when the ceiling was coming down. Hayes's bioelectric recovery pathway was not a drain. Aris did not have an adequate metaphor for what it was. It was the most active, most aggressive, most high-capacity biological recovery mechanism he had ever documented in any species in 31 years of xenobiology. It was running at a level that his instruments had initially misread as an error because the level was outside the parameters the instruments had been calibrated to measure, because no known species had a bioelectric recovery pathway that operated at anywhere near this capacity, and so the instruments had not been built to read it. Phil had recalibrated. The reading was not an error. Aris sat with the cellular analysis for 2 hours. He went through the medical literature, not just the human-specific literature, which was limited and recent, the full cooperative xenobiological library, 600 years of Grolian medical documentation. He looked for any species with a comparable recovery mechanism. He found nothing. At hour 8, he called Fenn. Fenn answered from what appeared to be his quarters, which told Aris the call had woken him, and Aris did not apologize because the data did not warrant an apology. It warranted immediate attention. He said, "Your decision weight research. The human neurological architecture paper." Fenn said, still half asleep, "What about it? I need you to look at something else. I need you to tell me if what I am about to send you is consistent with the architecture you documented." He sent the cellular analysis. Fenn was quiet for a long time. Aris heard him sitting up, heard the sound of a light activating, heard the specific silence of a scientist encountering data that required complete reorientation. Fenn said, "Where did this come from?" "A cadet, 22 years old. He took a Class-4 Velthari discharge at 1 meter." Another silence. "Aris," Fenn said slowly, "a Class-4 at 1 meter should have." "I know," Aris said. "He is currently in my bay with an 87% bioelectric disruption that is now 61% and dropping." A very long silence. Fenn said, "That is not possible." "I am aware it is not possible," Aris said. "I wrote the paper. Send me everything you have on human neurological architecture. Everything. Published and unpublished. I will explain why when I know why." By day 3, Jordan Hayes regained consciousness. Aris was in the bay when it happened, which was not a coincidence because Aris had been in the bay for most of the past 72 hours, sleeping in the chair beside the monitoring station for intervals that his own body required and not 1 minute more. He had not done this for a patient in 20 years. He had not done it because it was not scientifically productive. A doctor needed rest to function, and a resting doctor was more useful than an exhausted one, and the instruments did the monitoring whether the doctor was present or not. He had done it this time because the instruments kept showing him things he had not seen before, and he did not trust himself to review them secondhand. He needed to see them as they happened. He needed the unmediated data. What he had seen in 72 hours had dismantled, systematically and completely, 11 years of professional certainty. The bioelectric recovery rate was the most dramatic finding, but not the only one. The tissue repair around the primary impact site was operating at 4 times the rate documented in the human medical literature, which was itself considered unremarkable. Unremarkable relative to what? Aris had begun to ask. Relative to Thar, who healed faster than humans by a factor of 2. But Thar had dense secondary tissue layers specifically evolved for trauma absorption. They were built to be damaged and recover. Humans were not built that way. Humans had none of the structural features associated with high trauma tolerance in the species that had it. And yet, the pain response data was the thing that had kept Aris awake on the second night when he should have been sleeping. Hayes was conscious enough for autonomic responses to register even while he was not fully awake. The pain signals from the impact site were extraordinary. Aris had never seen a pain signal profile that high in a living patient. The kind of signals that species with pain tolerance limitations simply did not survive long enough to generate. Hayes was generating them, and his autonomic system was not shutting down. It was not going into the shock cascade that should have followed a pain profile that severe. It was managing it, absorbing it, processing it the way Aris processed an uncomfortable chair, as an input, as data, as something present that did not require the system to reorganize around it. He was sitting with all of this, reading Fenn's unpublished research on human neurological architecture, when Hayes opened his eyes. The eyes focused slowly. Aris watched them track across the ceiling, to the monitoring equipment, to him. The focus that came into them when they landed on him was not the confused, unfocused gaze of a patient waking from critical sedation. It was the gaze of a being assessing a new environment, taking in information, building a picture. Hayes said, in a voice that was rough from the breathing tube that had been removed 12 hours ago, "How long?" Aris said, 72 hours. Hayes processed this. He looked at the monitoring equipment. Aris watched him read it, not glancing at it, reading it, with the specific quality of attention that Aris had come to associate over the past 3 days, with everything he was learning about this species. Hayes said, "The disruption is at 22%. He had read it from the display. Correctly. Aris said, "Yes. That is lower than the fatal threshold for most species." "For most species, yes." Hayes looked at him. "What is the fatal threshold for humans?" Aris said, "I am currently in the process of determining that." Something moved in Hayes's expression. Not surprise. Not alarm. The specific quality of someone filing new information. He said, "You do not know. The medical literature on human bioelectric tolerance was established from a sample size of 11 patients over 6 years," Aris said. "The sample size was inadequate and the methodology was flawed, and I am now aware that it produced conclusions that require substantial revision." Hayes said, "How substantial?" Aris looked at him for a moment. He had been a doctor for 31 years. He had delivered difficult information to patients before. He had a protocol for it, refined over decades, that balanced clinical honesty with appropriate framing. He set the protocol aside. He said, "Your bioelectric recovery pathway is operating at a capacity that has no documented parallel in any species in the Cooperative's medical registry. Your tissue repair rate is 4 times what the human literature documents, and the human literature was already considered adequate. Your pain tolerance profile over the past 72 hours is the highest I have recorded in a living patient in 31 years of practice. You took a Class-4 Velthari energy discharge at 1 meter, and you are awake and reading my instruments 3 days later." He paused. "What I am telling you is that the medical community's understanding of human biology is wrong. Not slightly wrong. Foundationally wrong. And you are currently the evidence for that." The medical bay was very quiet. Hayes looked at the ceiling for a moment. Aris watched him process it, the same way he had watched him process everything, completely, and without the emotional noise that most patients brought to significant medical information about themselves. Hayes said, "The other cadet." "Oh, say." Aris said, "Uninjured. She is the reason you are in this bed." Hayes nodded. He closed his eyes. For a moment Aris thought he had gone back to sleep. Then Hayes said, without opening his eyes, "You said foundationally wrong. What does that mean for the recovery pathway?" Aris said, "It means your body is doing something that should not be biologically possible for a species with your structural profile. It means the capacity you are demonstrating was not anticipated by anyone who has studied human biology, because nobody has studied human biology adequately. It means," he stopped. Hayes opened his eyes. "Say it." Aris said, "It means that what you demonstrated by surviving this injury is not an individual anomaly. Individual anomalies do not produce consistent biological mechanisms. Mechanisms are species-wide. What you have, every human has. The Cooperative's medical community has been studying humanity for 11 years and has been studying the wrong things in the wrong ways and has produced a picture of a species that is almost entirely incorrect." Hayes was quiet for a moment. He said, "What are you going to do with that?" Aris had been asking himself this question for 72 hours. He had an answer. He had reached it at approximately hour 48 when he had stopped fighting the data and started following it, the way a good scientist followed data, wherever it went regardless of where he had expected it to go. He said, "I am going to publish the most significant xenobiological paper of the last century. I am going to retract my previous work on human bioelectric tolerance. I am going to contact every xenobiologist in the Cooperative's medical registry and tell them that everything we thought we knew about this species requires re-examination from the beginning." He paused. "And I am going to tell you something that I have not told another living being yet." Hayes waited. "The recovery pathway you are demonstrating," Aris said. "The capacity of it. It is not just greater than documented. It is greater than anything the Cooperative's biology has produced. In 600 years of Grolian medicine, across 400 documented species, we have never seen a bioelectric recovery mechanism with this capacity. Not in species that evolved in radiation environments. Not in species that evolved in high-toxin environments. Not in species that evolved anywhere that should have produced this kind of adaptation." He looked at Hayes. "The closest analog I can find in the literature is theoretical. A paper published 40 years ago by a Velthari biologist named Soren who proposed that a species subjected to sufficiently sustained and varied biological pressure over a sufficiently long evolutionary timeline might develop a generalized biological resilience mechanism rather than the targeted adaptations that most species develop. Not resistance to one specific threat, resistance as a baseline state. The capacity to recover from damage as a fundamental biological orientation rather than a specific response. He paused. Soren called it adaptive generalism. The paper was considered speculative. Nobody has cited it in 30 years. Hayes was very still. Aris said, Earth's evolutionary history is 4 billion years of sustained and varied biological pressure. Every extinction event, every environmental catastrophe, every pathogen, every predator pressure. Your species survived all of it. And Soren's theory suggests that surviving all of it, the specific combination of all of it, does not just produce a tough species. It produces a species whose baseline biological state is recovery. Not recovery from one thing. Recovery from anything. The medical bay was absolutely silent. Hayes said, very quietly, Does the cooperative know? No. Aris said, Not yet. What happens when they find out? Aris looked at him. He thought about the question. He thought about the power balance in the cooperative, about the species that had built it and maintained it, about the assumptions baked into every treaty and every military doctrine and every strategic assessment. He thought about what it meant that those assumptions were built on a picture of humanity that was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Foundationally wrong. He said, I do not know. That is the honest answer. I do not know what happens when the cooperative understands what you are. I know what should happen. The medical literature should be corrected. The strategic assessments should be revised. The entire framework of how humanity is understood should be rebuilt from the data up. He paused. Whether that is what actually happens depends on whether the beings who hold power in this cooperative are the kind of beings who follow the data. Hayes looked at him for a long time. He said, Are you? Aris had been a cynical being for 63 years. He had held his theory about humans for 11 of them with the confidence of a doctor who trusted data over narrative. The data had revised his theory. He said, I am publishing the paper. Whatever happens after that is not something I am willing to manage by staying quiet.
Hayes said nothing. He looked at the ceiling. After a moment, he said, The cadet I covered. Oh, say, she is breath. Yes, Aris said. He understood where this was going. The paper produces what you think it will produce, Hayes said. If the cooperative rebuilds the framework, is there a version of that where what you found in me is useful to species like her? Aris had not gotten this far in his thinking. He had been consumed by the finding itself, by the data, by the implications for understanding and classification and the correction of 31 years of wrong assumptions. He sat with the question for a long moment. He said, Adaptive generalism, as Soren described it, is a biological architecture. Architectures can be studied. Studied architectures can be understood. Understood architectures can, in some cases, be applied. He paused. I am not making a promise. I am saying that the question you just asked is the right question, and I had not asked it yet, which tells me something about the difference between a doctor who treats patients and a being who thinks about what the treatment is for. Hayes closed his eyes again. After a moment, he said, I need to sleep. Yes, Aris said, you do. He sat in the chair beside the monitoring station and watched Jordan Hayes sleep, this human cadet who'd stepped in front of a weapon that should have killed him in 0.4 seconds and had spent 3 days being impossible and had woken up and in his first conscious conversation had asked not what does this mean for me, but what does this mean for someone smaller and frailer than me. Aris had been a cynical being for 63 years. He was going to have to revise that, too. The paper was published 47 days later. It was titled Adaptive Generalism and the Human Bioelectric Recovery Architecture, a foundational revision of xenobiological understanding, and it was co-authored by Aris, Fenn, and 3 other researchers who had reviewed the data and reached the same conclusions. It was the most downloaded paper in the history of the Cooperative Medical Journal. The Cooperative's strategic division read it within 6 hours of publication and immediately classified it. The classification was overturned by a judicial review 42 days after that because the data belonged to science, and science did not answer to strategic considerations. which was a principle that the cooperative's legal framework had enshrined 400 years ago when beings wiser than the current strategic division had understood that the alternative was worse. The xenobiological community began the process of rebuilding the framework from the data up. The strategic divisions of 17 species began revising their assessments of humanity. And in a research annex of the Cooperative Medical Journal's editorial offices, a Velthari biologist named Dr. Soren, now 91 years old and long retired, received a notification that a 40-year-old theoretical paper had been cited 47,000 times in the first week following Aris's publication. She read the citation count twice. She made a cup of tea. She sat in her chair and looked out the window at the sky of her homeworld and thought about a theory she had published at 30 years old that nobody had taken seriously and that had apparently been waiting, quietly, for the species it described to produce the evidence. She thought about the human cadet who had stepped in front of a weapon in 0.4 seconds. She thought about 4 billion years of sustained biological pressure and what it produced in the end. She drank her tea. She thought it was the best cup of tea she had ever had. And in a medical bay on Kellon Station, Dr. Aris filed the retraction of his previous work on human bioelectric tolerance with the clinical efficiency of a being who had been wrong and knew it and did not flinch from saying so. He attached a note. It said, "I held a theory about humans for 11 years. The theory was that they were unremarkable. I held it with the confidence of a scientist who trusted data over narrative. I was right to trust data over narrative. I was wrong about the data. The difference between those two things is the whole story."